This is Tom Daly interviewing Bill Jamieson on March the 8th, 2023 for Deerfield Oral History. So, thank you, Bill.
My pleasure. Thanks, Tom.
Let's start with, what is your full name and where were you born?
My full name is William Stuckey, my great-grandparents' name, Jamieson. I was born in Florida at a naval hospital, but was only there a month or two before we ended up in California, where I grew up and spent. So I claim myself as a native of Northern California.
And how old are you?
I'll be 80 this year.
Good. What brought you to this place?
To Deerfield or to North
Deerfield.
Carolina? To Deerfield. At one point, we moved to North Carolina from Arizona in '95, and my dad died in 2001. I didn't know much about Deerfield. I was at All Souls, and every now and then they would say something about Deerfield, and a place within a half hour of your house that I can move to. She lived in a place called Wickenburg, which is about 50 miles west of Phoenix, northwest of Phoenix. And one of my neighbors was marketing director here. So I went up and talked to her, and she said, "Oh, come on out and I'll show you around at Deerfield." Because Mom was very specific. She wanted a place that offered continuing care. She had visited a friend in one in Scottsdale, Arizona. So I came here and she showed me around, and I walked into her office. She said, "Now, when we go out, I want you to tell me when you know this is an Episcopal facility." I said, "Okay." So we looked at cottages, we looked at condos, we looked at apartments. Then we went in for lunch, and she said, "Well, have you discovered why it's an Episcopal facility?" And I said, "No." She said, "Well, you passed it coming in here. It's the pub. We were the only facility in North Carolina that had a pub." And she said, and she was Presbyterian, and she said, but about that time, after Mom got here, and I was out here 4 or 5 times a week, usually to have lunch or dinner or just visit. We lived in North Asheville. Kennan's mother moved in with us. She was 91 and lived with us until she was 98. And she progressively, it got more difficult to give her the care she needed. And it got to a point where we couldn't go out without getting a sitter to come in. Yet my mother here, I could visit any time. One time she had an accident and ended up at the hospital. They called me. I got to the hospital before they did. I got back, they'd already had her apartment cleaned up, and I said, "This place is really something." So Kenan and I got on the long-term list. And then when Mom died in 2009, we just said, "Well, we'll come maybe in 10 years. And I was ready to come earlier. Kenan was not. She loved her garden. We had a beautiful yard.
Okay. What is the earliest ancestor you know about, and where and when did they live?
Well, know about or know, those are two different things. The first ancestor I know about, my mother's father was an ardent Presbyterian, Church of Scotland Presbyterian. Never forgave my father for converting my mother to an Episcopalian. He told me a story about one of his ancestors in, I think it was 1685. His name was John Brown, and he was a Presbyterian, Covenanter, and the king had sent his soldiers around to get all of these Scottish Presbyterians to sign a covenant of support for him and the Church of England, and he refused. And in front of his wife and his children, they executed him. And when my girls were 12 and 14, they're now 50 and 52, we went to that area. It's outside of Edinburgh, and we found the monument out in the middle of a cow pasture to John Brown. So that's the first one that I know of. On my dad's side, the first one I know of is a guy by the name of Andrew Jamieson, who was born in Northern Ireland and died in Virginia, and his son James was my grandfather's grandfather. James is the interesting one. He was a minister in the Methodist Episcopal Church. He was a farmer. He was an educator. He was one of the founders of Randolph-Macon College. Mm-hmm. He and 3 guys on horses rode around trying to find a place to build this college. He fought in the Civil War, but he gave me credibility in Kennan's family. I mean, she brought this West Coast guy back to this rural family in Virginia. And when they found out that one of my relatives had been the president of Danville Women's College in Danville, Virginia, which was Kennan's hometown, all of a sudden they thought maybe I'd be okay. And my granddad's mother was a Yancey from this part of North Carolina.
Where else have you lived besides here?
We've lived a lot of places. Kennan and I met in Japan. She was working at an Army hospital. I was stationed at a Naval Air Station. And we were married in Danville, went back to Japan and lived in a little house off the base. An extraordinary experience that the mayor had loaned to us, the mayor of the local town. We moved from there to after I got out of the Navy, to Northern California. When I went to work for my father. Was there a very short period of time, and Dad moved me to Phoenix. And I worked for him for about 6 months, and it was very clear that that was not a relationship that was going to work. So I moved to a nonprofit in Phoenix. It was a startup, and then went to Shreveport, Louisiana to start the same thing, which was an interesting move, where my grandparents lived, my mother's parents. Then from there, we went to Atlanta, from there to Washington, and from there back to Arizona, and then from Arizona to here.
Okay. Tell me about your parents, a little bit more detail. Where were they from, and what did they do for a living?
My mother was born and reared in Oklahoma, and my dad was born in Prescott, Arizona, and reared in Phoenix. Dad, they met at the University of Arizona. My mother went out there because of asthma problems in Tulsa, and Dad, that was just the natural place for him to go. So they met there, and Dad was in what they called in those days the cavalry, which is ROTC today. But all he wanted to do was fly airplanes, and the Army didn't have a lot of airplanes. So his junior year in college, he was looking at graduating and becoming an Army officer, but he'd go out every weekend and he would fly airplanes out at the little local airport. And he met this guy who was on leave from the Navy, and the guy said, "Look, if you graduate, you've got to go in the Army. But you're a good pilot. I've been flying with you for a year. I'm pretty sure I can get you a commission in the Navy, but you can't graduate. If you graduate, you have to live up to your contract." So Dad quit school, ended up in flight school, and I ended up flying airplanes, PBYs, for the Navy, scouting out submarines and Japanese ship positions. And Mom was taking care of me at that point. Then Dad was severely injured and spent a couple months on a hospital ship, and then a year in the hospital, lost both of his legs.
How was he injured?
His airplane was destroyed at Midway, and they didn't have a replacement for him, so they transferred him onto the Bonhomme Richard, an aircraft carrier, and he was a flight deck commander. And a plane was coming in, Dad waved it off, and he came in anyway, and crash landed on the deck. Dad got all his men off, but Dad didn't get off, and he ended up in the hospital ship. And it was interesting, the doctor who removed his legs ended up also at Mare Island Naval Air Station, or Mare Island Naval Shipyard at the hospital. And Mom and I and my grandmother lived in a Quonset hut in a place called Guadalcanal Village. for well over a year. And then when Dad got out, he and another amputee, they had to stay in the area to do rehab, had multiple jobs. Dad worked for Ford Motor Company teaching other amputees how to drive a car. They hung advertising signs and buses, but most importantly, he and this other amputee set up a card table in the Casa de Vallejo Hotel, installed a telephone, got an airline guide, a bus guide, train guide, and started selling tickets to guys who were getting out of the service after the war, and they needed to find a way home. And over probably almost a decade, they turned it into the largest independent travel agency in the United States.
Wow. Did he lose both legs?
He lost both legs, one just above the knee and one just below the knee. It hampered him in that his dream, and he never got over this, he was a pretty angry man much of his life. His dream was to be an aeronautical engineer and stay in the Navy. And he couldn't do that. The Navy said no. But he became a very successful businessman. He had his own airplane that he flew until he was well into his 70s. He had an ocean-going fishing boat that he had a captain on it, but he owned an Indianapolis race car that never won anything, but he went to all the races. So he accomplished a lot, he did a lot, and he built a great business. He was a very difficult man to live with.
Tell me about the building that you grew up in, that your family lived in. And was that the only one, or did you move several times as a child?
No, we moved once as a child.
But what was the building like?
Okay, well, when Dad got out of the hospital and we moved to a house in Vallejo, California, and I was there till just through my first grade year. And Dad and some other guys got together and they pooled their money and they bought a big area of rural, about halfway between San Francisco and Sacramento, rural area that was the world's largest cherry orchard. Then they turned around and sold it to a developer of country clubs. And what they got for that was the lifetime membership in the country club, and they got to pick a lot to build their own house. And so Dad drew number one, so he got to pick his lot, and it was a beautiful lot right on a little stream in the middle of this cherry orchard that eventually became the 15th hole of a golf course. As I thought back on it as I got older, I thought, oh, that was a really nice big house. I took my grandson to see it. It's a tiny little house, but it's still there. Dad built it for $17,000. And one end of the house, they had their bedroom, and the other end of the house, there was a large room separated by sliding doors, my brother's bedroom and mine, and then a guest room, which eventually, when I got into high school, became my room. But we stayed there, and I would spend with my friends hours and hours on end hiking in the hills. We were just over a hill from Napa. Okay. So it was a great, ideal place to grow up. We went to a one-room school. We had a crank telephone. My telephone number was too long and too short.
Yeah. We're going to get to your schooling in a minute.
Yeah.
You mentioned your brother. Were there several siblings? Or
one.
Jerry
was 5 years younger than I.
Okay.
Spent most of his life, the last 30 years, as a scuba diver in Hawaii, and is now building a house up in the mountains here. He looks out he should move in May. He's been living in a camper van for over a year with his two cats. Look out one side of it, you see the river. You look out the other side, you see the Maricopa County landfill.
Describe a little bit about the community in which you grew up, including your teenage years. Were there gathering places and groups that you belonged to?
There weren't any groups. I had an aborted test with the Cub Scouts, and that lasted not very long at all. I refused to wear that silly little hat, which indicates something about my style and my later career. Went to a one-room school. When I got there, I was in the second grade. I was the second person in the second grade, a guy by the name of Mike Mariano, who's now a developer of the area. But Mike and I, by the time I graduated, there were 5 of us in the 8th grade. So the school was the gathering place, fall school. Got a second teacher when I was in the 7th grade, but Mrs. White kept the first. She was the only teacher when I got there, the 1st and 2nd and the 7th and 8th grades. Our dads were all guys starting their businesses after the war, so we had no coaches. We played basketball outside in a court that was dirt and full of black walnut shells. In order to compete with the rural district in flag football, we have to have 6 people. We only had 5, so Marion Seaby, a delightful young girl, became our center. And we had to have mixed teams for softball, but we had no coaches.
Yeah,
it was a great handicap to me when I got into high school. I loved baseball, never played it. We had no place to play baseball, nobody to teach us baseball, no little leagues. By the time I got to high school and I said, I'm going out for the baseball team, I'm like, God, those guys have been playing since they were 6. But I'm still a big baseball fan, even though I've never played the sport. Yeah. I've coached it, umpired it, but never played it.
You mentioned that school. Would you go through and tell us a little bit about all the schools you've gone to, different ones?
Yeah, I went to fall school, and was at socially it was a great place to be, and we had a lot of fun. But I didn't learn basic. I was a horrible reader, for instance. And then I went to the local public high school where I learned that I didn't really have to study, and I came home with straight A's without cracking a book. And Mom said, no, this isn't going to work. And I ended up going to a boarding school in Menlo Park, California, the Menlo School. And it was a life changer for me. I don't know where I'd be today without that. We were very fortunate, and the one really fortunate thing about Dad's injury, the state of California had a fund to pay for the tuition for the children of disabled California veterans. And since he got out of the Navy in California, his business was in California, that included us. So all the way through boarding school and college, until I went to graduate school on the GI Bill, the state of California's fund paid not only books, tuition, but also $200 a month, which to a college kid was a lot of money. Yeah. So anyway, I went to Menlo, and it turned my life around. My second or third week there, I was in Eugene Salisbury's English class. Now, Eugene was a really big man. He'd been a heavyweight gold gloves boxer in New York when he was in college. And at the end of class on this particular day, he said, okay, class dismissed except you, Mr. Jamieson. I want you to come up here. So everybody left, and I walked up and I sat down. He said, I said to come up here. I did not say to sit down. So I stood up. He said, Mr. Jamieson, your work for me is horrible. You can't spell, you read too slow, but I've seen your tests, and you're really kind of smart. And so I'm going to give you 3 choices. Choice number 1, you can quit and go home. Choice number 2, you can work with me before your sports practice and after dinner during what is supposed to be study hall. You can work with me for this year. And I think we will have you on a good course. And choice number 3 is I'll beat this out of you. I said, I'll take number 2, sir. He stayed with me for 3 years. Coached me, taught me, helped me learn how to manage time, got me into a reading program, and made sure I got to college. Yeah. I'm not sure I ever would have been accepted anywhere without Eugene Salisbury. I had the great privilege. At one point, there was a community college on our campus, and I was invited back to speak to one of their programs, and had the chance to go over and see him. He had retired but was still living on the campus, and tell him how important he was to me. And I've had some people do that for me, and I didn't know how important that little trip was. I had a similar person in college who helped me a lot.
And then you went to college.
Then I went to college. I wanted to go to the University of Arizona. Menlo School was supposed to be a prep school for Stanford. Where a lot of our graduates went to either Stanford or Cal Berkeley. I had no desire to do that, and I did not have the academics to do that. I was one of many who didn't. But so I wanted to go to the University of Arizona. I did since I was a little boy. And they said, no, that's not prestigious enough. The private schools get little check marks. So they said, here's a list of schools, all on the East Coast: Washington and Lee, William and Mary, University of Virginia, and Tulane. And you're going to apply to all of those. They got my mother and her dad on their side. So I did, and I didn't want Washington and Lee, William and Mary, or University of Virginia because they were boys' schools. And had very restrictive lives for freshmen, and I had already done that. Tulane, while it was technically a boys' school at the time, or a men's school, they had Sophie Newcomb on the campus. But I only lasted a year there. I had trouble blending the life of New Orleans with the life of a student. Yeah. And I was perfectly happy getting C's. My dad was not happy with that. So I said, well, Dad, I'll transfer to the University of Arizona. And he said, well, I want you to study business. So I said, okay. So I transferred to the University of Arizona my sophomore year. Same fraternity, so I just had a built-in community when I got there. I enrolled in business major, which lasted one semester, and my dad never knew that I switched to journalism. My mother knew, but she said, don't tell your father. And my goal in life, Tom, was to graduate, go to officer candidate school, spend my 2 to 4 years in the Navy, and then go to Al Summers Umpire School in Florida. And I was sports editor of the Daily Wildcat. I was also sports editor of the school and my high school paper. And I wanted to write sports, but I wanted to be an umpire mostly in the minor leagues, because I thought there was a mystique there. I was a fan of the San Francisco Seals, which predates the Giants. Then I discovered that if you didn't have a B average, you didn't get into officer candidate school. So I had to get straight A's my junior and senior year, and I did. And I got into officer candidate school. I was 2 units short, technically, of graduation. So I went to the University of Hawaii for 3 months after I got out of the University of Arizona. Just before I reported to Tulane, to the officer candidate school in Rhode Island, which is my first experience in cold weather. Got there in October.
What was your experience like in the military? I'm assuming you went on.
I did. I spent. I had I think it was a 3-year commitment, but I spent 4 years. I was very fortunate in a number of things. One of my good friends from OCS was on the Pueblo, the ship that was captured by the North Koreans. Another was flying helicopters in Vietnam. But I went to Scotland as a public affairs officer for a submarine squadron. And so at age 22, I had levels of responsibility that in the civilian world would have taken me 10 years. And I had a commanding officer who was a captain, but because he was the head of the squadron, had the title Commodore. And he just took a real interest in me, invested a lot of time in me. And I was not in the submarine line of succession, so I wasn't any kind of a threat. I wasn't trying to climb up the ranks. Mm-hmm. So we would go off together off the ship every now and then and have a drink, and he taught me how to drink scotch. But I was the only bachelor officer other than the Catholic chaplain. So I took my powder blue Mustang with me when I went, and I had a great time. And then I get this call from the Chief of Information's office saying, we want to send you to Japan. There's a crisis there, and we think you can handle it. I said, who's there now? And it was a full commander, and I was a lieutenant junior grade at that point. But he said, but you have to extend for a year. So best decision I ever made because it got me to Japan where I met my wife.
Yeah.
But so I went to this Naval Air Station, and I had a commanding officer there who even had invested more in me, and he was absolutely extraordinary man. He was the first commanding officer of the Blue Angels. He was in Korea was an ace pilot, just an amazing man who I think he should have been an admiral, but he wrote a letter about how absurd the Vietnam, or what would he call him, about how absurd the Vietnam War was and how hard it was for him to be sending his pilots off to a war where that he couldn't explain to them why we were doing it. And of course that ended his career. Yeah. They did bring him back after retirement to handle the repatriation of the POWs, and I kept in touch with him until he died. Arthur R. Hawkins Jr., amazing man. And he put me in areas of real responsibility. One time I said, Captain, I'm only 24 years old, and Japan is an age graded. He said, you're not going to learn unless you get in and do it. And I said, well, I'm likely to make some mistakes. He said, that's good. The more mistakes you made, the more we can analyze, and you're going to learn. And he thought I was going to stay in the Navy.
But you did end up flying?
No, I never flew.
Oh, you never
I was
flew.
public affairs officer there too,
okay.
Also. And it was interesting. The North Koreans shot down one of our reconnaissance planes, lost about 25 people, including a really good friend. And I had to handle all of the international media that flocked in there. One time the Japanese were protesting our base. They were convinced that we had nuclear weapons stored there. And so we had this big fence between the road and our base that was erected to keep the protesters out. And I can remember sitting in, and we had an admiral who was commander of the Fleet Air in all of Southeast Asia there, and somebody from the embassy and my boss. We were sitting in the admiral's office, and the guy in the embassy said, somebody's got to go out and talk to those people. And the admiral said, Lieutenant Jamieson will do that. I said, Admiral, I'm just a kid. And he said, yep, and it's much easier to fire a kid than it is to fire an admiral. Get your ass out there. And so I went out. I have this great picture in the Asahi Tribune of me with my beautiful blue uniform on, standing in front of these guys with hard hats and shields and swords. It was interesting. I got into a conversation that was rather testy with an NBC reporter by the name of Rich, who insisted on meeting the relatives of the deceased. Yeah. And I refused to do that, and then we refused to release any names until we had the permission of the wives, mostly. One of the people who died was my closest friend.
To switch gears a little bit, how did you and your family celebrate holidays?
That's a very interesting question because Kenan grew up in a very large family. Thanksgiving is 100 people. Cousins, second cousins, third cousins twice removed, divorced spouses. I mean, just everybody comes. It's chaos. I came from a small family. My nearest relative was in Los Angeles, my dad's sister, and we'd see them maybe once a year. My mom's sisters lived on the East Coast, Florida and Pennsylvania. I saw them maybe 3 times in my life until my cousin Jim and I went to OCS at the same time. And our Thanksgivings and Christmases were just the 4 of us. Kenan's were 100 people. She still goes back for those. I do not. I found in the second Thanksgiving and the second family reunion, I was hearing the same stories that I'd heard when I was back there in 1999 getting married. Yeah. And they just gotten bigger. And they had this, read this in a former columnist for the Asheville Citizen-Times. She was talking about going to a reunion, and she said the rule is the first person to breathe is the designated listener. That's a perfect description of Kennan's family gatherings. I wish I'd thought of that phrase because I love it. So her last family reunion at the beach a couple of years ago, I went to Hawaii by myself.
So in your immediate family, you said you have two girls?
I have two daughters. One lives in Tryon. Her husband's an equine vet.
In that family, when they were growing up,
Mm-hmm.
and it was you and Kenan, did you have any family traditions?
Well, yeah, we did, but again, it was mostly just us.
Okay.
We did Christmas. My parents, when they were young, we lived in Phoenix. My parents lived about 50 miles away. So we'd pick up my grandmother, and my two daughters, Kenan and I, would drive up to Wickenburg, where my parents lived, and we'd have Christmas there. Thanksgiving, we'd always meet, and Easter, we'd always meet somewhere in Phoenix for lunch with them.
Okay. You've been married to Kenan. How long and how did you all meet?
We've been married 53 years. I was a very happy bachelor in Japan. There were a lot of single women, single American women, teachers and nurses, and I had a volunteer job coaching youth group swimming, so I got out and I met a lot of people, and I just had a really great, fun bachelor's life. And this lieutenant commander's wife, Beverly Ripsco, came in to see me once in my office, and she said, "Bill, you know, I volunteer with the American Red Cross over at the hospital. There's this lovely young blonde over there who I think you ought to meet." And I said, "Beverly, I'm perfect. I'm really happy. You know, and I think I'm fine." She said, "No, she's my lieutenant commander's wife. I had to listen." She said, "I really would like you to meet her." So I said, "Okay." She gave me a phone number. I called, and Kenan said, "No, I can't go out with you. My mother's here. My mama is here." I said, "Okay, I'll try again." So I tried again, and Mama's still here. And I thought in my own mind, 3 strikes and you're out. I'll try one more time and tell Beverly I did my best. Well, third time she accepted. And I thought, well, this will be interesting. I had an old Jeep that I reclaimed from a military junkyard. And I drove out to Zama Army Hospital, where she was stationed. She was American Red Cross. And it was chaos. There were firemen there and police or MPs. And there's this one frantic woman running around with her hair in curlers and a bathrobe on. Kenan had walked out to get something and didn't have the key to get back in. So that was my introduction to Kenan. And we dated off and on for about a year until I proposed. And it was, in itself, was interesting because an old girlfriend was from college was visiting me at the time. And it made it very clear to me that I really did love this woman and didn't want to live with anybody else. Kenan wasn't quite so sure. She had to call her mother. She said, "Oh, yes, but I got to talk to my mama first." And we didn't have cell phones, so that call took a while. But we ended up, she got out of the Red Cross, went home, planned the wedding. I flew out there, got married, and we got back to Japan together. Had a great time.
You mentioned your children. Tell me about them. And you have grandchildren? We
do. Suzanne is 52, and she'll be 53 this year. She came out here. She graduated from Northern Arizona University, and all she wanted to do was work for a baseball team. When she had been a junior, I had taken her on a 6-week cross-country camping trip to all these little towns, so we'd go into Portland, Oregon, or Raleigh, North Carolina, and she'd go knock on the door of the general manager of the minor league team and introduce herself and say, "I really want a job." So she had to graduate in December, semester early, because they had baseball hires in December. So December of her senior year, she went to the annual meeting, which was held in Florida, and she got 2 offers places I'd really never heard of before. One was in Raleigh. I'd heard of Raleigh, but the other was in Hickory, working for a minor league team. She chose, it was right outside of Raleigh, she chose the Carolina Mudcats. And then she met Rich, and she had children, and after the first baby was born, it didn't fit with working for a minor league baseball team where you are literally working from day to night. I mean, she had to get to the ballpark on game days early in the morning, and she didn't leave until after the umpires had been fed, after the game was over. And so she and Rich had a baby, and then they had a second baby, and then they had a third baby, and then they had a fourth baby. They moved here when the second child was about one. Rich graduated from vet school and got a job at the equine hospital in Tryon as a resident. And that over the years, he became a minor partner in this equine hospital, which built its own hospital over adjacent to that new equine center there. And then Suzanne started a business when Rich was in school. At first, she was working primarily with early childhood education nonprofits, doing PR stuff and community relations stuff for them. And over the years, that grew into a pretty good-sized business with private clients as well as early childhood education clients. She has a reading program based in Washington, D.C. that she does work for.
And her name is?
Suzanne.
Suzanne.
Beverly Kennan, on the other hand, had decided she was not going to go to college, and instead she was going to go back to Argentina, where she had spent her junior year in high school. Unfortunately, she was involved in a very serious automobile accident after graduating from high school before she could go to Argentina, and it took a long time to get over the anger of not being able to do what she wanted to do. She was hit broadside by a drunk driver and was hurt pretty badly. So it took her a few years of wandering, working as waitress or bartenders in Arizona, and then she came out here when we moved out. I came out in '95 to visit Suzanne for opening day of her first season, and in March, when I drove up to see Bennett Sims, who had been an old friend from my days in Georgia. We had just sold our business, and he said, "Well, why don't you come and join me?" I thought, well, we'll think about that. And to get there, I drove, of course, past Asheville, and I'd never heard of Asheville before, never heard of Hendersonville before. I went back and I told Kennan, when you go visit Suzanne, you ought to look at this place, Hendersonville. Bennett said that we maybe could build something. He said he doesn't have any money. We'd have to raise money, but we sold our business, and I served on some corporate boards, so we were in pretty good shape financially. And so she came out. She didn't much like Raleigh. She spent the night in Asheville. She went to a gallery crawl. She loved it. 2 days later, she bought a house. And I said, "You bought a house?" She said, "Yep. I hope you and Bennett are serious." "Where?" "In Asheville." I said, "What is Asheville?" And she said, "Well, it's a nice little town." I said, "Do they have a baseball team?" She said, "Yeah." I said, what do they call themselves?" She said, "The Tourists." I said, "What?" "The Tourists?" You'd be the Mountaineers or something. So when I moved out here, she and her mother came out before me, because I had taken a job in the intermediate time with the diocese, and I couldn't leave until October, and I had taken a group to Ireland and another group into the Sinai Desert. So she said, "Don't worry, Mom and I'll do the move." So kind of like Abraham, and I'll go to a place that I will show you. I had no idea what Asheville was, except in this case, it was like Sarah taking the camel, setting the tents up, and saying, "Okay, you can come now, Abraham. I've got everything set up for you." Beverly Kennan was bartending in Phoenix, and decided she wanted to move out here too, but she wanted to live near the water, so she went to Wilmington, got a job at the airport there. And then a friend of hers and her moved to Emerald Isle. She, again, was waiting tables, and then she got a job as an office manager of one of her best friend's father's business, which was recruiting high-tech engineers for large companies like General Electric. And then she became the research director. She's really a smart person. Never been to college, but probably one of the smartest people I know. But also very, very much an introvert. She lost that job in the recession when nobody was hiring engineers and the business closed down. North Carolina in those days was fairly progressive, which is one reason I really wanted to move here. They had a really good unemployment insurance program that was almost double what you get in most states, and they paid for her to go to community college. She did some research and found that recession-proof jobs included things like legal assistant. She said, growing up in your house, Dad, we met too many lawyers. I don't want to work for a lawyer. The other was being a data processing person for hospitals. So she is now a coder for a hospital near Emerald Isle, and is very happy. She can get up. She works at home. She can get up and log on at 4 in the morning and be ready to go to the beach early afternoon. She's still an introvert. Her welcome mat on her door says, "Go away." She's a challenge, but she's happy, and that's the most important thing.
That's really good. So tell me a little bit about your career, because you've done quite a few things. After you left the military, after you left the Navy,
my career was really, if you look at it on a flow chart, it looks like it makes great sense. But if you look at it piece by piece by piece, you say, how in the world did he, or why in the world did he do that? I started, as I said earlier, with my dad. It was not a good fit. He was paying me well. Got it right out of the Navy, $16,000 and a country club membership and a car and health insurance. But I didn't like the work, and I couldn't stand his general manager. I said, "Dad, your general manager is ripping you off. He's not honest." "Oh, he's on." So Kenan was pregnant at this point. Kenan and I talked about it, and she said, "Well, let's start looking for another job." And so I applied for a job in Clarkdale, Arizona, which is near Prescott, where my grandparents started, and as the publisher or the editor of their local newspaper. And I'd worked there once when I was in college. And the guy offered me the job, and so we're sitting in this little restaurant, Kenan and me and this publisher who owned several weekly newspapers. And Kenan, who's pregnant, said, "Well, are there any other young people here?" And he said, "I think Mabel, who's the waitress, I think she's about your age. Other than that, no." Kenan said, "We're not going to do that." So I read in the paper about a startup nonprofit called the Community Organization for Drug Abuse Control. A group of doctors and business guys all of a sudden discovered that it wasn't just Mexicans and African Americans who were using drugs. It was now in their schools, and they wanted to do something about it. So they started this nonprofit. It had a total of 1 employee. He was on loan from the newspaper as the executive director. And I read about it in the paper, and I went over there and introduced myself. Don Jackson is his name. I said, "I want to come to work for you." He said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I don't know anything about drugs, and but I'm pretty smart, and I'm a good talker, and I think maybe I could be an administrative assistant." He said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, I read about it in the business section of the Arizona Republic. It's somebody who'll do everything you don't want to do." He said, "Okay, I'll hire you. I'll pay you $4,000 a year, but I can't give you any benefits." And so I had now she's 7 months. So I go up and tell my dad that I'm going to leave. He said, "You can't do that." And I said, "I'm doing it, Dad. This isn't a good fit for me or for you." He said, how are you getting home? I said, I'm driving. He said, not in that car, that's a company car. So I had to call somebody to come pick me up. We went out and bought an old used Volkswagen as our only car. No health insurance. So we sat down with Kennan's doctor and he said, okay, well, we'll time this right so that you don't come into the hospital before you're ready to be birthed. And if you do, I'm sending you home. So we thought the baby was coming. Suzanne was about a month late. After a flood in our house where we had water up to our calves. She went in and he examined her and he said, nope, you're not ready yet. I want you to go out and have a cup of coffee and hang around for a while. As long as we admit you after noon, you don't have to pay. I think it was like $100 a day in the hospital was all, but we didn't have that. Yeah. So she came back and then Suzanne was born. And she was the great reuniter of me and my father and my mother. We named her after my mother, Suzanne. And she became the light of our life. So that job went really well. Thanks to Senator Goldwater, we got a lot of national attention, and they gave us a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to do a workshop for other communities on how to start this community program. That consisted of one treatment center, one education program, and then a live-in place, all run. We were sort of an establishment front for what was basically a long-hair organization. One of the groups that came were from Shreveport. And I said, oh, I'd like to be the host for Shreveport. My granddad lives there. I went to Tulane for a year. I know Shreveport really well. I was with them for the whole weekend, and about a month later they called and said, we'd like you to come to Shreveport and be our executive director. I said, okay. I said, it's a startup. We can't pay anything until you raise the money, but we'll give you a loan for your moving costs. Okay. So Kenan said, yeah, let's do it. So we packed our about 8-month-old baby up and off we went to Shreveport. I loved my work, but it was work where I was gone. I had to raise money. Yeah. I was doing speeches to breakfast clubs. I was doing speeches to dinner clubs. I was writing grants. I had somebody loaned us an office. I had one desk and a volunteer secretary and a young kid who was helping run the high school program. Jimmy Carter was elected governor in Georgia, and he set a team around the country to look at community programs for drug and alcohol and mental health issues. One of the first places they went was Arizona. And Dawn, my former boss, said, well, you said you were going to stop in New Orleans and see her family on your way back to Georgia. Why don't you stop in Shreveport and see my old assistant, Bill Jamieson? And they did. Kenan was very unhappy. We had one car, which I had go to work in. She had a baby. We were living in a place that had no other stay-at-home moms. And all she had was her baby. So I had made the commitment that once I got some credentials, we would look at moving. So this couple visited us, and that led to an invitation to give a speech in Albany, Georgia. Albany, as they call it, Georgia. And one of the guys who was attending the speech was a lawyer from Atlanta, Jack Watson, who ended up as Carter's chief of staff when he became president, or towards the end, the last year and a half. But Jack was the head of the mental health, or the chair of the board of mental health, and he was a lawyer with King and Spalding, which is the biggest law firm in Georgia. And Jack heard my talk, and he said, we've got a drug and alcohol program in Atlanta called Metro Atlanta Council on Alcohol and Drugs. And they're about to go bankrupt. And the United Way said if we find somebody who will come in and commit to lead it for a year, we will fund them for one more year, and then we'll decide the viability. Would you be interested in that? So I said, well, yeah, I've been in this other place for only a year, but I've accomplished what I said I would, and that's raise the money and get them set up and get the program started. So they sent me to Atlanta to do an interview, and they offered me the job, and so now I'm getting paid $19,000 a year, and health insurance. And Kenan found a house that she liked in a neighborhood she liked with other young mothers, and we had 2 cars at that point. We had an old Volkswagen van that I bought from the priest of our local parish, and a car that a used Chevrolet that we bought. So she had a car when I went to work. I guess we'd been there for 6 months, and they got hit by an ice storm. Beverly Kenan was born just before the ice storm. So here I am sitting in this house with no electricity, trees down everywhere. My office, which was right off of I-20 downtown, right across from the ballpark, was full of, the electricity worked. It was the IBEW building. So I packed them in the car, and it took us an hour and a half to navigate our way the 10 miles to downtown. But so we lived there for a while. But I really enjoyed my time at MACAD. But then Jack became chairman of the Board of Human Resources. And in the Georgia system, the board appoints the commissioner, not the governor. The governor appoints the board. And so the board makes all the major decisions. The governor can overrule them, but and then when Carter created the Department of Human Resources, a massive 28,000 person operation, to get the last vote in the Senate to agree to this reorganization, which brought public health, Medicaid, and all the social services together in one department. He had to agree that a particular person, Jim Parham, who was the head of the welfare department, would not be named commissioner. So Carter named a young 28-year-old accountant commissioner, told him that he was really working for the deputy commissioner, who was going to be Jim Parham. So Jack offered me a job as executive secretary to the board and assistant to the deputy commissioner. And that was really fun. I took that after a year, but I built this place back up. It's still there. One of the guys I recruited is still there 20-some years later, 30-some years later. So I went to work for the department, which was big, and they gave me progressively bigger jobs to do over the years. I never worked for Carter, but my boss did, so I got to sit in meetings with him and got a feeling for him, and it was the first time I'd ever really thought about politics. I mean, I can remember back when I was in the Navy, Tom, they really did not like Lyndon Johnson for clear reasons, particularly the aviators, and they wanted to take up an offering to give to Richard Nixon, contributions, and I was the junior guy, and so I was the one who was supposed to collect these, and he said, well, you know, we need to elect a Republican. He'll get us out of this war. I said, Captain, what's the difference between Republicans and Democrats? I had no idea. So now I'm working for this Democratic governor in his administration. I had a really great time because I loved Jack. He was fantastic. But Jimmy Carter became my model for not how to do politics, but you can be a successful politician and be honest all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. You were always on top of the table. He always was. You knew where he stood, which didn't help him a lot when he was president. He was overly executive. I mean, he thought he was running a submarine. It worked in state government. He was contemptuous of the legislative process. I mean, really contemptuous, to the point when he was president, Tip O'Neill said, these Carter people think the Speaker of the House is something they put in their living room and listen to the radio through. But so I learned both the good side, that you can be successful and be unyielding in your integrity, but you have to build relationships with the other pieces of government. The democracy is not a majority rule. In order for there to be a lasting democracy, you need to build kind of what you're doing. Jim taught me that. So watching Carter, I never worked for him again directly, and Jack and Jim taught me that.
So then after that?
After Carter left, everybody else, I was looking for a job because his last year we all started looking for a job. Mm-hmm. We had no idea who was going to get elected. It turned out it was George Busby, who was also a Democrat, and he asked us all to stay, but we didn't know that. So I applied. I actually offered a job in Florida. We went and didn't want to live in Orlando, and that wasn't going to work. So I offered a job running the department in South Dakota, and all it took was one visit there to realize that I didn't want to do that. So I went to Washington. I stayed there and then working for a guy who was my friend. He was a mental health director when Carter was in office. He became the commissioner, but it just wasn't the same. I loved Jim and Jack, and I loved working for them. Jack went off to Washington as Secretary of the Cabinet, which is kind of the job he created for me at Georgia, mm-hmm. and Director of Intergovernmental Relations. And Jim came back and was working in intergovernmental relations in the social service side of it. They offered me a job in the Office of State and Community Affairs in HEW, then called HEW. I learned in Washington, the longer your title, the less important you are. You have the president, the Secretary of HEW, the Assistant Secretary of HEW for Human Development Affairs, the Director of the Office of State and Community Affairs, and that was me. Kennan was really not that happy living there. I was leaving home at 6:30 in the morning. I was getting home at 7 at night. We had a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. And so I started looking for another job. Mm-hmm. I didn't like Washington. It was too far removed from the people. I really enjoyed my job in state government because you not only got to do all the fun things of running government agencies, you also got to meet the people you were serving.
Yeah. Is that when you went to Arizona?
I applied for a job. I applied for a job as Secretary of the Human Service Department in South Carolina, and it got down to 2 of us, me, 30 years old, and a guy who was 50. And this process went on and on and on and on. And he got the job, mm-hmm. and I just was desperate. I didn't know what to do. And I can remember sitting next to the window and it was snowing, saying, okay, God, if you mean for me to stay here, I'll stay here. I don't want to, but that's what you mean. I'll figure out a way to make it work. Next day I go into work and I have this note to see the Undersecretary of HEW's Chief of Staff. And he said, Secretary Califano's supposed to go give a speech in Arizona. He can't do it. Would you go out and do it for him? It's an intergovernmental group. I said, sure. That's my field. And while out there, I met Bruce Babbitt, who was the new governor. We talked and kind of hit it off. He suggested I apply for the job out there. I did. And I thought I was going to be the token white male. The other candidates were Hispanic or African American. And lo and behold, I got the job. Called Kennan after my interview with the governor, after my interview with the search team, then I interviewed the governor. And then on my way out, they said, the governor wants to have dinner with you tonight. They offered me the job. I called Kennan and said, my dream job has been offered to me. And she said, what's the pay? And I said, I don't know. I didn't ask. So we went back to Arizona and were there for 17 years. Yeah. I worked for Governor Babbitt for 6 years. Then we started our own business, which we did from 80. He was reelected in 82, so 85 through 92.
Your own business?
We started I was working on the most amazing thing I ever worked on in my life. I was working on a project that we had 30 days to complete that IBM said couldn't be done in less than 6 months. And we had to do it. It was a $100 million issue. And we did it. So I was in the newspaper every day. I was doing 2 press conferences a day. I was meeting with the Republican and Democratic caucuses of both houses twice a day. So I was very visible, and my name, we did it, and so my name was gold. So I started the Bill Jamieson Company, and all of a sudden I had people knocking on my door to be clients. Kenan and I were the only employees, and we got one of those office complexes where you get this little room, and then there's somebody who answers your phone and answers the phone of everybody else there. And it grew, and we got more clients, and I brought in Alfredo Gutierrez, who was the minority leader of the Senate, and he has a partner. So we took on a lobbying business, and all of a sudden we had eight or nine employees, and we were billing well over $1 million a year.
So it's a lobbying firm.
Well, I started it as a firm. My idea was a firm that would help. Most large firms have lobbyists. Would help a firm put together its philanthropy, its business plan, and its political plan, so that they're speaking the same vision in all of them. And that's what I was doing. I had clients like Phelps Dodge Corporation. But as Alfredo joined, we more and more got lobbied. I didn't like the lobbying work. It was very lucrative. New governor came in. Arizona went through, it was 6 governors, and only one, Bruce Babbitt, completed a full term. Governor was impeached by his own party. The Secretary of State becomes the governor, and she asked me to come back for 6 months and help get things moving in her first legislative session, which I did, and it was the most fun thing I ever did, because I wasn't going to stay, but I knew I didn't want to go back to my business. So I was, at that point, I was sitting on a couple of corporate boards, and they paid me well, and I was doing some adjunct teaching, and so I sold my share of the business to Alfredo. It was called the Jamieson Gutierrez Company after he joined, and they continued until he ran for governor and lost, but he ran against Janet Napolitano in a primary and lost a very close race. But anyway, I then took a volunteer job as administrator of the cathedral. Entered the deacons program. Was teaching 2 days a week at Claremont School of Theology in California. I'd fly over on a Thursday morning, teach Thursday, lead a spirituality group Thursday night, teach Friday morning, and fly home. And they paid me like a full professor. And I had summers off. That's when I did the 6 weeks with Suzanne and camping trip.
So how did you, I guess when you were in Atlanta, that's when you met Bennett Sims?
Yeah, we were a member of a small Episcopal church, a round church with the altar in the center. Charlie Roper was the priest. And it was a transitional area in South DeKalb. Our neighborhood, when we moved in, was all young, sort of lower middle income white people. Gradually, it turned into middle income black people and us. And as more African Americans moved in, more older white people moved out. And all of a sudden, the church leadership, senior warden, junior warden, everybody had moved to Cobb County.
Yeah.
And so Roper calls me in one day and said, I want you to be my senior warden. And I said, what's a senior warden? And he explained it to me, and so I said, well, I'll think about it. And so I did what any brash young man would do. I went home, I picked up the phone and called the bishop. I'd never met. And his secretary, who was later his wife, Mary Page, said, well, he's really busy, and what do you need? And I said, well, I need some advice. I've been asked to do something at church, and I want to know the bishop thinks about that job and a younger person having it. She said, okay, well, he'll call you back. And Bennett called me back and he said, let's have lunch. And that started a long time relationship. Mm-hmm. We had lunch together once a month for a couple of years. At one point I told him I thought maybe I needed to go to seminary, and he said, oh my God, no. He said, you're doing a ministry. Your work, you're working with people in poverty is your ministry. Then he retires and he takes Institute for Servant Leadership at Emory. Mm-hmm. It was a combination of the business school and the theology school. Business school gets a new dean. He said, I don't want to deal with these seminarians. And so Bennett left, took his institute and moved to Hendersonville.
Yeah. And that's when I met him, because I'd read his books, but I came to one of his institutes.
I went out to one of the institutes with another man who was a major factor in my life, Wesley Frensdorf, who was a bishop, born in Germany of a German Jewish father and a Lutheran mother. They got out just in time. He ends up in New York, where he was reared both by Jewish grandparents and by Lutherans, and his mother decided she didn't like the Lutherans there, and so they became Episcopalians. He became a bishop eventually in Nevada.
So I need to
wrap it up.
Begin to wrap up, and I really want to ask you some of these questions. What would you say is the greatest challenge, the greatest challenges that you faced in your life?
Balancing my work and my family. It became easy when I became director of the department, because I could say to people, I'm going to leave at 4 o'clock and coach my daughter's softball team. So we'll do the budget meeting at 7. And I did that. Then I realized that I was upsetting other people's balance. But we worked it out. But that was a real challenge, because I was passionate about my work. I was more passionate about my family, particularly my girls. I almost got into running for elective office at one point, and then I realized that if I were successful, by the time I finished, the kids would be in college. Yeah. And I would have missed all those years, and that's not worth it to me.
Yeah. What kinds of values did your family or community hold up, either when you were growing up and then in your immediate family? What kind of values are the most important ones, would you say?
Honesty, I think, is the most important. As I said earlier, my dad was a very difficult man to live with, and I did not, and his values were very, very conservative and somewhat racist. So I sort of learned different values by not wanting to be him. And then from my mother, who was, to me, a hero. She sort of stood in between her sons and this very harsh man, who was an extraordinary man and accomplished amazing things, but he's very difficult. And she made sure we didn't fight the battles with him, and that she fought them for us quietly. And then I learned mostly from the two commanding officers that I told you about, and from Jack and Jim, and in the witness that watching Jimmy Carter is where I probably learned a lot of the values that formed who I am today.
Okay, last question.
Mm-hmm.
What has provided you with the most satisfaction in life? What are you most proud of?
I guess there are several things. I'm trying to hone it down. I'm most proud of the fact that Kenan and I reared two amazing young women who are following their own drummers. The values that Kenan and I lived by, inclusiveness, honesty, is right into their fabric, and I'm very proud of the relationship that I have with my granddaughter, who graduated from the University of Arizona from Tryon, and is now working in San Diego. And then finally, I think I watched a couple of your other ones, and somebody, I think it was Bill, maybe said this, that I was in Phoenix a few months ago, and I was in a grocery store, and this lady came up and said, "You're Bill Jamieson?" I said, "Yes." She said, I just can't tell you how you changed my life. And then the last example, and I did a lot of this, I was in a meeting, one young woman who was a clerk in a computer clerk. The assistant directors were trying to explain something to me, and I just wasn't getting it. And she spoke up and articulated exactly what I needed to hear. So I invested in her. She had never been to college. We got her not only through college, she went through graduate school, and 2 governors later succeeded me. And that, I am really proud of that in terms of more important than any of the other work accomplishments that I had, Linda becoming my successor just really made me proud.
Yeah. Thank you so much for meeting with me.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry I wandered off course too many times.